Welcome back, everybody. You're watching video 3 for week 2. In this video, we're going to be talking about dimensions of ableism and types of ableism. Okay, so as you can imagine, there are individual dimensions around ableism, such as language and slurs that are used when we target individual people with acts of oppression or discrimination. And often those cases of inaccessibility where a single individual can't get into a building, can't get onto a form of transportation, is being denied some sort of employment. When we talk about structural dimensions of ableism, well, then we're talking just about design barriers. For example, before the ADA, there wasn't curb cutouts. So imagine trying to navigate the world as a wheelchair user. You move down a street and then you've got this sort of insurmountable barrier. So there was very little ability to leave one's home, to access transportation, to get employed, because the world was structurally designed not for their inclusion, not to allow people to do it. When we get to universal design, so often when we design the world with disabled folks in mind, that it has a benefit for everybody. For example, curb cutouts have a benefit if you're walking with someone with a stroller or a cart of some sort. These things aid the benefit of everyone and also allow for accessibility for folks who maybe are using some sort of wheeled form of transportation. Yeah, so again, physical barriers and design barriers are often what we talk about structural forms of ableism. We also have cultural forms of ableism, the way in which disabled folks are represented or honestly not represented in media. It's this invisibility of the disabled culture and community. People don't even know about disability identity. Most people wouldn't even have a clue what deaf culture is and why they wouldn't see their community as having a disability. They just see themselves as a linguistic minority. Another form of cultural ableism is that forced segregation of disabled people in society. Again, that landfilling, moving into institutions, special education versus mainstream education, pulling these groups apart and keeping them separate from one another. Another example of ableism in the media, just pay attention to the movies you're watching and the TV shows you're watching. Usually, if you see someone disabled in a movie, often they're the villain. Folks with a visual difference, maybe have an asymmetrical face, have some sort of scarring, burning, that they're often the villain. Again, so having this sort of physical or visible disability often sets you aside as someone who's villainous. When someone is disabled, they're often that inspiration porn. Oh, look at the insurmountable odds that this person is surpassing. When people talk about inspiration porn, it's really about who is being centered in that conversation. Is that video for other disabled folks? Is that representation for them? Or is it really for the people without a disability? Is the message something like, wow, if they can do it, so can I? When you hear people talk about inspiration porn, it's like the primary audience being spoken to isn't the disabled community. It's people outside of that space. Again, when people are disabled in media, they're often sort of the pitied. Also related to that inspiration porn is this super crypt stereotype. A super crypt is a disabled person scaling Mount Everest, a blind man climbing Mount Everest, and so on. Okay, so 3 dimensions: individual, structural, and cultural. There are more. There are also medical dimensions. Again, thinking about who's getting institutionalized, this conversation around forced or coerced sterilization, the push for a cure at any cost. Again, Stacy Milburn's story of losing a summer as a child so that they could have a straighter head, even though it wasn't providing any functional improvement in their life and anything maybe causing additional pain. Yeah, in terms, again, lack of access, lack of insurance. We also have financial and legal dimensions of ableism, differential pay rates and how much one's paid per hour, the lack of accessible housing, marriage inequality. For example, sometimes folks who are on disability, because this tight restriction around the amount of assets, amount of money that they're capable of having, people will sometimes choose not to get married or maybe choose to divorce. so that they can access this disability insurance, these disability funds. As meager as they are, sometimes it's leading to a barrier to one getting married. There's also just the precarity of ADA. The ADA is constantly under attack. We're all often living in a society where we're talking about these austerity politics, wanting to shrink the social safety net in our country. So there's always this tremendous sort of ableism attacking any of these systems that allow people to be disabled, provide any sort of accommodation or support. And then also these financial legals around immigration and detention centers. Who is allowed to immigrate? I'm probably going to show a video in the future where someone talks about getting an autism diagnosis or wanting to get one in their later adult life. And one of the things they talk about is like right before they're about to receive the diagnosis, they basically says, no, I don't want it. They're more worried about the societal consequences of receiving that diagnosis. And so here's one small example related to immigration and detention. If you have an autistic diagnosis, you might be ineligible. You might face a barrier from being able to immigrate, being able to be accepted as a refugee. Again, certain groups around this concept of disability are being barred or kept out of these processes. Another example, not related to immigration and detention, some folks who are transgender and also autistic, people will use the autism diagnosis to say that you're incapable of making decisions about your gender. And so accessing gender affirming care might be barred to you because of that diagnosis. And if you actually look at the data, this is a really concerning thing because the gender expression and sexuality orientations are quite diverse in the autistic community. And so there is a lot of trans folks, a lot of non-binary folks inside that disabled space. All right. So again, more dimensions: medical, financial, structural, individual, cultural. Let's talk about types of ableism. The first is physical ableism. Physical ableism is hate or discrimination that's based on a person's physical appearance or one's physical limitations. Mental ableism is discrimination based on somebody having a mental health condition or some sort of cognitive difference, maybe in their learning style. Medical ableism exists both interpersonally, such as between the healthcare provider, can be an ableist person, and systemically, as decisions determined by medical institutions and caregivers might prevent the exercise of rights, having their own autonomy and making decisions. I think that trans example I gave about an autistic person not being able to access gender-affirming care could be an example of medical ableism. Structural ableism is failing to provide accessibility tools like a ramp, a wheelchair, special education equipment, etc. Cultural ableism is behavioral, attitudinal, social patterns that may discriminate against the dignity of disability symptoms, deny or dismiss special needs, or make disability rights and accessibility unattainable. We also have this idea of benevolent ableism. Ableism that masks and appears as something that's kind. People treat the disabled well, but they also sometimes treat them like children, or this infantilizing process, instead of treating them as full-grown adults. Examples could include ignoring disabilities, not respecting the life experiences of the disabled person. Benevolent ableism can also be experienced as microaggressions, not considering the opinion of the disabled person in the important decision-making process. It could be invasions of one's privacy, personal boundaries, forced corrective measures, unwanted help, someone just grabbing someone's wheelchair, let me help you, let me push you up this ramp without asking for consent. Not listening to other people's unique needs. There's also hostile ableism, is a cultural or social kind of ableism when people get hostile against disability symptoms or phenotypes, physical appearances of a disabled person. We also hear about the term internalized ableism. I've used it already in these videos. It's when a disabled person discriminates against themselves, or other disabled people by holding a view that disability is something to be ashamed of, or something to be hid, or by refusing accessibility or support even for themselves. When we talk about a disability in higher education, I'm going to throw up some stats about the rates of disability here on UC Berkeley's campus. Again, the largest group are students who probably have a disability, but aren't coming forward and claiming any sort of accommodation. There's a lot of reasons that may be. It may not always be related to internalized ableism, but in some cases it is, because for fear that one might be seen a certain way, that someone might be seen as less capable. If you come forward, will someone see you as a viable candidate for a doctoral program or for a scholarship, and so on. So you can imagine that there's a lot of reasons, structural reasons, and then also internalized reasons for not wanting to access support when it would benefit them greatly. Well, let's talk about some ableist stereotypes, and there are many. Lazy. There is actually a book, I don't have anything assigned from it, but Devin Price, I believe is the author's name, where they talk about laziness does not exist. There is a pretty compelling argument to say that the very construct and definition of lazy is really invalidating. There might be people choosing not to engage in an activity, but oftentimes when lazy is being used, it's often talking about people who might not have the ability to engage, might be sensory overwhelmed, might be experiencing chronic fatigue. Again, this lazy is often rolled out and applied to people with disabilities. If you only tried harder, if you only had a more positive attitude, if you only had more faith. Also, we've talked about this, inspiration porn or a supercrypt, that basically overcoming all odds. Another is that this pitiful, tragic individual or character. Another ableist stereotype is that if you maybe have a psychiatric condition, or very common for folks with autism, that they're dangerous, that they're violent. That example I had where the news article talked about that they wouldn't allow families to adopt a dog at a rescue, an autistic child in the family. Again, it's this Cummings idea that they're going to be dangerous, maladjusted, angry, hurtful. Also, that they can be predatory, they're monsters, they're supervillains. Other stereotypes include unintelligent, childlike, helpless, incompetent, socially inept, asexual or sexual deviant, kind of runs to both extremes. That idea I've already mentioned, but better off dead, and only want to be cured. That's really the only possible option if you have a disability, is that, oh, you must be seeking a cure, you must be wanting relief, as opposed to people who have accepted their disability status. Other related terms that I think are important is you often will also hear about disableism. And so ableism is sometimes reserved for talking more about the ways in which there's this societal push towards able-bodiedness, this hyper-focus on the beautiful, the symmetrical, the athletic body. And then disableism is sometimes talked about when we're like specifically talking about the discrimination against disabled people. Again, where ableism is discrimination and privilege in the favor of non-disabled people. And then active targeting and discrimination is often referred to as disableism. So disableism, ableism shouldn't be used interchangeably because there is a difference between the two in relationship to their focus. Disableism focuses on the production of disability, where ableism focuses on the production of ability. Disableism is a set of assumptions and practices promoting the differential or unequal treatment of people because of actual or presumed disabilities. Ableism is a belief that impairment, irrespective of that type of impairment, is inherently negative and should, if any opportunity presents itself, to be ameliorated, cured, eliminated. The disability in ableism is defined by its deviance from ability, which suggests that people with disabilities as a group are inferior to people without those disabilities. Yeah, so again, they're related. We often are talking about them at the same time because they're definitely in this tight little dance with one another, but we should be using them distinctly. Again, disableism is that set of assumptions and practices of treating disabled people unequally, whereas ableism is that belief that any type of impairment should be cured or eliminated, that it is the most desirable form of being is to be in that able-bodied form. Again, related but different. You often will also hear about the word saneism or mentalism or psychophobia. It's discrimination against or the oppression of individuals perceived to have a mental disorder or a cognitive impairment, a cognitive difference. Saneism, mentalism, psychophobia refer to the systemic discrimination of individuals perceived to have that mental disorder or cognitive difference. This can include people of all different kinds: autism, learning disabilities, ADHD, bipolar, schizophrenia, personality disorders, stuttering, tics, intellectual disabilities, and so on. You will also hear terms like autism, which is discrimination and oppression directed towards deaf people. Autism is described by deaf activists as a form of discrimination directed specifically at disabled people, which may include those diagnosed as deaf from birth or otherwise. And it's a term that first started being used in the mid-1970s. And there's also some terms that came up in our readings for this week by Amia Mingus. She talks about abled supremacy, sort of thinking about white supremacy that centers and says that being white is superior to other racial categories. Well, here we also live in an enabled supremacy place, where having an able body is superior intellectually, physically, that there is such a thing as abled privilege, abled entitlement, and so on. Abled privilege being those invisible social advantages held by people who are able-bodied over people who are disabled. So I have another quote here by Mia Mingus that helps bring it all together, all these different sort of types and dimensions. Abled culture teaches abled people to be entitled. You are entitled to never have to learn anything about disability and ableism. You are entitled to get to move through the world and through our movements with little to no understanding or political analysis about disability. Even as you pontificate about every other system of oppression and violence, abled culture in our movements means that we will say we must center those who are most impacted all day, every day, but then not include folks who are disabled, especially those who are high risk in the center during a global pandemic. Abled entitlement means that you will still continue to plan your vacation abroad, even amidst the Delta surge. You will still post pictures from your giant family gathering amidst the Omicron surge. And again, this quote is coming from January 16th, 2022. On this slide, I have two tweets that are coming from the hashtag EverydayAbleism. So the first one is from @WheelerDax. It's a diary of a disabled person. And this tweet reads, "Just got a hard stare for transferring from my wheelchair into an armchair in a coffee shop. Hashtag EverydayAbleism." We have this ingrained thought that people are often lying, that lazy idea even, that they're faking it. They just want special privileges. Somehow disability benefits are so rich and plentiful and allow you a comfortable life, which we know is exactly the opposite. But when people see someone in a wheelchair, there's this automatic assumption, well, that they're entirely without the access to mobility. And for many folks in wheelchairs, they're still able to stand, they're still able to transfer, but they can't get around from point A to point B without the assistance of the wheelchair. But when people see people stand up and reach for a cereal box on the second shelf or the third shelf, people will then target them and say, faker, or you're not actually disabled. You don't need that wheelchair. And then from another tweet from @EllenFFB, sigh. Uber driver parked, saw me and my guide dog, and then very obviously drove off and canceled the trip. Hashtag EverydayAbleism. this is a very common story. So if you follow any of these hashtags like EverydayAbleism, Instagram, and so on, you will be hearing more and more examples of these types of phenomenon. All right. This is the final two quotes, again, drive home the way that ableism operates in our society. This is a quote from Rochelle Walensky, who was the director of the CDC when we were going through the COVID pandemic. Quote, "The overwhelming number of deaths, over 75%, occurred in people who had at least 4 comorbidities." So 4 disabilities, 4 health conditions. So really, these are people who were unwell to begin with. And yes, really encouraging news in the context of Omicron. This means not only just to get your primary series, but to get your booster series. And yes, we are really encouraged by these results. And I have a response to that quote from Susan Henderson, who is the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund Executive Director. "Your words convey that the deaths of disabled people are acceptable. Not only is this message from the head of the CDC abhorrent, it perpetuates widely and wrongly held perceptions that disabled people have a worse quality of life than non-disabled people, and that our lives are more expendable." So be clued into the media you're consuming and the news articles you're reading, and the way that ableism might be sort of implicit and sometimes just overt, but somehow it's embedded inside of the way people are talking and the framings they're using. Again, this idea that, well, if you have 4 comorbid conditions, their life quality must not be that great. And so if you're able-bodied and don't have a comorbid condition, you don't have nothing to worry about. So again, who's being centered in that conversation? Are we centering the needs of the people who are most impacted? Or are we centering the people who are least impacted or less likely to be impacted? Okay. So we've covered quite a bit of ground in this video, and I look forward to seeing you in our next one, where we're going to walk through some disability models. Okay, I'll see you there. Bye-bye.